This is a lecture for my administrative law class. It might also be useful for my Leg-Reg class. And we are going to do a quick unit overview about legislative controls of agency actions to sort of highlight for you what you should be learning in this chapter. So again, we have a unit in administrative law, and this is true in almost every administrative law casebook, that is the way Congress or the legislature exercises control and influence over administrative agencies. And what my goal here is to give you a quick introduction or overview of the things that we're going to learn or that you should be watching for as you go through the materials to help you understand why some of the cases we're going to study matter, or some of the changes matter, why agencies are doing the things that they're doing, or Congress has done what it has done. Some students may also find it helpful at the end of the unit to review this video, just as a kind of quick big picture look back to see if you can explain to yourself what you learned on each of these points, or now that you look at these points, you understand them better. So without further ado, we're talking about legislative controls over agencies. And from a constitutional standpoint, the single biggest way that the legislature or Congress controls agencies is through the enactment and repeal of the agency's enabling statutes. And so Congress can call an agency into existence by passing a statute. In theory, if they then repealed that statute, the agency would cease to exist. You can, through legislation, legislate an agency out of existence. Or to put it another way, sometimes you'll hear presidential candidates promise that they're going to abolish certain federal agencies. That will almost always require an act of the legislature. The agencies are generally created and their powers and authorization by statute, and then are abolished by statute typically. So the enabling statutes give the agency their powers and their legal authorization to exist. More common, though, is simply amending the agency's enabling statute to broaden or narrow its powers or to impose additional procedural burdens on its actions. And so we're going to have some cases that and talk about issues that deal with that, the change in the agency's statute, or the agency sort of having to deal with a stricter statute than other agencies have, or a narrowing of their powers. It's, for whatever reason, sometimes it's hard to get the votes in Congress to completely abolish an agency. And if you think about it, when people are running for re-election, their opponent can say, you voted to take this away, to do away with this. And that can be difficult or politically costly. So it's easier to sometimes to just amend the agency's statute. Don't forget that a lot of these agency enabling statutes have what we call sunset provisions, which is like an expiration date. And the most common time period is 10 years. So when they enact the statute, and this is a way that Congress can kind of indirectly control agencies and shape policy, they add a provision that it has to be reauthorized every 10 years. It could be less time or more time, but 10 is very common. What this means is that 10 years after the creation of the agency, it comes up for reauthorization. Now, normally this is just a perfunctory vote. It's a streamlined process. Very often there's like little or no legislative debate and no media attention to these reauthorizations. So they're typically not very politically controversial, and the agencies get reauthorized. On the other hand, if the agency has become very politically controversial, but neither side is sure they can get the votes to, let's say, repeal or amend their statute, or they're worried that it will backfire politically when they run for re-election, everybody can just decide to do nothing and let the agency expire. So if this allows basically a way to abolish the agent, to let the agency die a natural death, by not voting to reauthorize it. And then it's hard to accuse someone who was in Congress of they didn't actually vote to abolish or end the agency or take a vote to take away anyone's rights or protections. Instead, they did nothing. And that's gets less traction as an accusation. Okay, next, the second biggest area, apart from statutes and legislating, that the legislature has in its arsenal to control and influence agencies is control of the purse strings or the budget. So Congress passes a budget every year, and there's going to be an allocation for federal agencies that basically constitutes its operating budget for the most part. Some agencies also have funding sources from fines or fees that they collect, but most of their funding for most agencies is going to come out of the Treasury from the taxpayers and the allocation that they get from Congress. And so in theory, if you think about it, we can defund unpopular agencies or politically controversial agencies. And defunding can mean like budgeting them ridiculously low, or just not giving them a reasonable amount so that they can increase their staff. As an example, the ATF, which does a lot of our enforcement of gun regulations and gun licensing for gun dealers and so forth, is politically controversial, and they typically have funding problems, and so therefore they don't have enough inspectors to do frequent inspections of gun stores to make sure that they're in compliance with regulations, record keeping requirements, and so forth. So one way to kind of stick it to an agency is to give them, kind of stiff them on their budget a little bit, and it forces the agency to prioritize and only the most important functions or most important cases and so forth. Similarly, when we talk about budgets, keep in mind that Congress loves to throw in these super specific riders to an annual budget or omnibus bill that either prohibit or authorize very specific spending activities by agencies. So if you are taking a course that studies the TVA v. Hill case or mentions it as a note case, this is a famous case about the Tellico Dam, and where Congress kept earmarking money specifically for the completion of the dam, and it becomes a big issue when the case is argued before the Supreme Court, that was this a way that Congress was trying to repeal a statute that seemed to say the dam couldn't be completed by allocating more money. And so the courts kind of wrestle with this issue of repeals and authorizations through specific budgetary allocations. Conversely, there's cases that we have about Congress putting in a rider saying this agency can use no funding from its budget, from our allocation for this specific project that it's doing, or this specific activity, or to enforce a specific rule. And that essentially shutters that department of the agency, or tells the agency, you can't do this. They didn't have the votes or have to go through the process of amending their statute, which would have been the proper way to do it. So instead, somebody throws in a rider. And as you can imagine, the courts don't really like this. But we have cases about it. You're not going to see very many cases overall about agency budgets as a whole, but we do have cases in administrative law about this problem of specific riders that are authorizations or spending prohibitions. Next, we have something Congress can do that's really kind of just political, is, as opposed to statutory or legislative, is they have these committees and subcommittees that provide oversight of the government, and they have specific functions, and they will call in agency officials for hearings. You see this sometimes in the movies. If you like watching movies about like the Bourne Identity or the Mission in Black movies, and some of those movies, they have a scene where the officials running this spy program are called in and grilled by congressmen about what are you really up to and what are you doing and so forth. And or at the time I'm making this video in 2020, we had a lot of controversy about the post office and the new director of the post office, who was making a lot of cuts and closing offices and removing sorting machines from distribution centers and so forth. And we had highly publicized committee hearings where this the new director was grilled, and of course it was kind of embarrassing and so forth. And so the agency officials find these very stressful, these types of committee and subcommittee hearings stressful, because they're going to be grilled and humiliated by people from at least one of the parties and so forth. And they have in the back of their minds that the people grilling them in these oversight hearings control their budget, could defund them in the following budget cycle. Also keep in mind that the Constitution gives the Senate the right or the duty to confirm presidential appointees of directors. Now, the vast majority of these are perfunctory, again, and get no media attention. Most of the Senate confirmation hearings you will ever hear about are for Supreme Court justices, not for agency officials. But it does happen, and it's a way that the Senate can say no to someone who they think is really bad news or corrupt or too controversial. On very, very, very rare occasions, we could have impeachment by Congress of executive branch officials, not just the president, but people who are directing agencies who have committed crimes or are accused of corruption. Also rare is the invocation of something called the Congressional Review Act, which is like the legislative veto that you may have learned about in your constitutional law class. And so the Congressional Review Act allows Congress, if they have authorized the agency to do something, by a joint resolution of both houses signed by the president. But again, the process is kind of streamlined compared to usual legislative activity. They can basically tell an agency, you're not allowed to do that thing that you announced you were planning to do, or you're not allowed to implement that policy or something. So it's essentially a legislative veto by resolution as opposed to enactment. Okay, that concludes our mini lecture or quick overview of the legislative controls of agency actions.